Welcome back to Inside Politics on KTN News. Thank you for staying with us. This past week, the President, Uhuru Kenyatta, lifted or eased the restrictions for the COVID-19 global pandemic that have been in place for the last 4 months. Let's listen in.
Not yet met 100%, but we have met a reasonable level of preparedness across our counties. With this expert opinion at hand, and the counsel offered by the National Security Council, I therefore today announce a phased reopening of the country as follows. 1. Today I order and direct that the cessation of movement into and out of the Nairobi metropolitan area, Mombasa County, and Mandera County that is currently in force shall lapse today or at 4 a.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, the 7th of July, 2020. Number 2, I do order and direct that the nationwide curfew that is currently in force between the hours of 9 p.m. and 4 a.m. daily be and is hereby extended for a further 30 days. Fellow Kenyans, by reopening Nairobi, Mombasa, and Mandera, we must be cognizant of the fact that we are all much more at risk than we were when the restrictions were in place.
All right, let me begin with you, Mark. What are your initial reactions to this eased reopening by the President's cessation of movement in and outside Nairobi metropolitan area lifted, although it is being closely monitored? But as we speak, news that have come into our newsrooms in the last couple of hours that some 8 people are being traced after traveling from Nairobi to Bomet in a matatu that had one person who had been tested positive for the disease. These are some of the challenges that are coming with it. Sometime last week, in a single day, Kenya recorded 447 new cases of coronavirus. I know it is very dicey the way these tests are being done and announced, but do you think it was the right move to ease some of its restrictions?
I don't think that the president had much of a choice in regards to this matter, because you need to understand that the numbers did not explode as quickly as had initially been anticipated, which is partly testament to the measures that had been put in place. But at the same time, the economy and people's personal lives were suffering incurably. Beyond that, we did not go into lockdown to end the disease. We went into lockdown to slow down and to prepare for the disease. Now, a lot of counties have met the threshold of that preparedness, and true, some have not, but I don't think we had a choice other than to open up. Now, that ushers in the second phase of dealing with COVID, which is personal responsibility. This is about wearing masks. This is about social distancing. This is about avoiding unnecessary crowds, unnecessary meetings, going to restaurants that are very full. This is the time where we have to take COVID-19 the way we took HIV infections. If you refuse to wear a condom, the infection is not on the government's head, it is on yours. And it is also incumbent upon every Kenyan to also realize that right now, where we sit, we are actually bullets that could kill our friends and our families. What I mean is every Kenyan should assume that they are positive and not just move around and expose other people and aimlessly, because you could actually be responsible for the death of someone. A friend of mine died because a very rather careless person decided that their cough was not COVID and asked for a meeting with my friend. 12 days later, my friend was dead. So let's just be very honest here that the phase where the government was trying to make sure the virus does not get into our noses has ended, and it is time for Kenyans to realize that that responsibility is now on our own heads. And secondly, that the only line of defense that has not fully been put in place is our governors. And this is where you should have serious buyer's remorse if your governor, like the ones I hear in Tarakaniti and in Busia, only have about 9 beds each for the sick. If you voted for a governor like that, Pole Sana, best hope that when you do catch COVID, there are no symptoms. Otherwise, we might have to bury you in hazmats and very far from your relatives.
Hesbon, what is your thought on the eased reopening by the president?
Well, I think last week when we were having this conversation, I was a bit skeptical about opening up for the simple reason that we knew more about the economy bleeding, and there was a reason to open because we cannot have an economy bleed and expect to have a recovery period that is short. But we didn't have enough information about how we were going to handle the public health safety. But it seems like the president is a lot more informed and probably made a decision from a fairly, more elevated view of what is happening. But I think now that we are in this situation, it's important to note that there were 2 things that were likely to happen. With a prolonged lockdown of the economy, what the government envisioned was a situation where the public would be cushioned from a public health point of view at the expense of the economy. And after some time, the public would actually take the measures and have, a slow rate of infection and eventually flattening of the curve. But what we had was a lockdown that was hemorrhaging our economy, but the numbers were still increasing. And I guess something had to give. You cannot lose on 2 fronts, where you are locking down the economy to slow down the infections, and the economy suffers because of the lockdown, and the infections don't even go down, you don't flatten the curve. So what we have right now is a situation where we've been given, as Kenyans, an opportunity to make our livelihoods, an opportunity not to complain that we cannot die of hunger because we are locked down from corona. And the second responsibility that comes with that opportunity is that now the onus is on us to be a lot more careful. Because when the government took the bullet for us, we were not very careful and the numbers were going high. Now the government has decided that we are going to give in and transfer that responsibility to the public. And that is a responsibility that has come with a fear factor, which I think I celebrate. There is an aura of fear. People are saying that, oh, now we are on our own, which I think is a good thing. Because when you know that you have a responsibility, as opposed to a situation where you expect the government to rein in through the Public Health Act and be the one responsible, everyone abdicates their responsibility to be careful. Where we sit right now, the onus is on each and every one of us to take that responsibility and probably assume that we are on our own and no one is watching over us. We'll be a lot more careful. But then I think having said that, especially in as far as the movement of people from one county to another is concerned, especially folks who are in Nairobi, we have a greater responsibility to protect the demographic that is a lot more vulnerable because of either age or underlying conditions. Unfortunately, in Kenya, we don't enjoy the luxury of knowing our health status, and therefore you wouldn't know who has an underlying condition. But at least we know the age, and data is showing that they are a lot more vulnerable and susceptible to succumb. Therefore, we need to be a lot more careful in our engagement with them. And if possible, just stop that engagement. It is a show of love because you are protecting them. And I guess what we need to do going forward is to always think of the person next to us as a possible, infected person who can transmit that to us. Because, Ben, trust me, what happens is the fear factor that we had in February, March was higher than what we have right now. But ironically, the number of cases that are outside there are a lot more higher right now. And Kenyans need to know that there are more people outside there, and we are kind of called upon to have a lot of responsibility in how we go about our business to make a livelihood, but again, protect ourselves.
Before I come to you, Dismas, the president did ease the restrictions with a disclaimer. Let's listen to that.
Must give two qualifications to this phased reopening. Firstly, the order to reopen is given conditionally. Should the situation deteriorate and pose a challenge to our health infrastructure, we will have to revert back to lockdown. In the next 21 days, we shall study patterns of interactions and the spread of the disease. Any trends that signal a worsening of the pandemic, we will have no choice but to return to lockdown at zero option. Secondly, fellow Kenyans, this order to partially reopen will only bear fruit if we recognize that this exercise is a shared responsibility.
Very important words from the president there, Dismas, as you give us your thoughts and reactions to the reopening. A lot of countries across the world are looking at another phase of coronavirus infections, some of them worse than the first phase. The United States is a case in point. And some of their states, they are going back to lockdown. We are still recording high numbers. In fact, last week we recorded the highest in a span of 24 hours. Some of these things, qualifying to be what some of those conditions that the President was talking about when he said, should the situation worsen. Are we in line for going back to lockdown?
Ben, that probability does exist because immediately the cessation of movement was lifted. You saw people running from Nairobi as if they were in a prison, and there were even cases of road accidents happening because now people have said, let me go back to my village where I'll be able to survive with or without any structured income. But I still think at the end of the day, the clear message that all of us Kenyans must embrace is what Mutahi Kagwe said the other day, that when you come across any other human being, be it your wife, your spouse, your daughter, or any other person, you should treat that person as a suspect. And for some reason, we think that the only people who may be carrying that virus are people that you do not know. And I've seen when people are meeting, family gatherings, or even at clubs, wherever people are in a meeting, they immediately remove their mask because they're saying, these are people that I know very well. So they assume that those people wouldn't be carrying the viruses. But you see, if we keep on behaving in that manner, then probability of another lockdown is going to be very high, almost 100%. And I think for us to make progress, we must get away of the national government and the county governments working on the pain and pleasure principle. Because we've been told the key success factor here is embracing the non-pharmaceutical interventions of doing the mask, maintaining social distancing, contact tracing, etc. And for some reason, the average Kenyan is not following those instructions. So therefore it means that we must have the law enforcement officers to come into play and ensure that all the regulations set out in the Public Health Act have been respected. For instance, they should go around and ensure that everybody has got a mask. And if somebody doesn't have a mask, then they must have a penalty for that. If they don't do that, there's evidence to suggest that Kenyans, we are very lazy and we only respond to pain. When you give a good example of the US where the president finally is leading by example. You remember for the longest time he had indicated that he had no time for a mask. But last evening he was seen putting on a mask, is leading by example. And for people who are even doubting whether or not a mask is going to be useful, you can see that Trump is doing that. So I think for the Kenyan situation, it must be personal responsibility. If you do not take personal responsibility, the probability that we're going to have another lockdown is very high. Then the second level would be about our governors to ensure that they've got sufficient capacity. We've got now sufficient time for them to come up with resources, ensure that they've got enough isolation or quarantine facilities so that in the unlikely event of another outbreak, we are able to manage. But at the end of the day, it's still going to be an equation of economic prosperity because as the president said that he's going to open the economy gradually, for the people who already lost their jobs or lost their businesses, opportunities for income, the government must come and give them resources so that they start earning a living. Because it's useless to lift all these sanctions if people who have already lost their income opportunities are not able to gain that. Right. And unfortunately, majority of the interventions are actually targeting companies which had been mismanaged, and their stress is not occasioned by COVID, but they're using COVID as a scapegoat to get resources from the national government. Like, for instance, we were told that companies with over 200 employees are the only ones to benefit from some resources from governments. Now, when you look at it critically, how many companies in Kenya have got more than 200 employees? There are very few. So it effectively means that the majority of the SMEs have been locked out from these government incentives and interventions. So I think it's incumbent on the National Treasury and the national government to ensure that if they're giving out the incentives actually go to people who need these resources, majority of them SMEs, and the government is not rewarding people who had mismanaged their organizations. Like, for instance, the amount of money being set for organizations like Kenya Airways and stuff like that, they did not start making losses because of COVID. They started making losses because of their own mischief, and they must not use COVID as a scapegoat to get resources from governments.
Mark, very quickly, what are some of the red flags that should make President Kenyatta take us back to lockdown?
Now, some of the red flags, and the biggest one is bed capacity. The moment someone who's sick cannot access a bed in a hospital, that's a red flag. The second red flag is the number of infections per day that are detected. We already saw above 400. If it goes, in my view, above 1,000 per day out of 3,000 or so tested, then we need to look at that and consider a lockdown. The third thing that we need to consider is the breakage of social distancing laws. Why I'm saying this as another factor is we know very well, if you look at all the case studies, churches, clubs are the places where we got mass infections, 60, 70 people at a time. So if we see Kenyans returning to those behaviors, then we might need to call back to a shutdown. Now, that said, the truth of the matter, this will boil down fully to the county governments and the measures they're making, not only just in terms of hospitals, but also in terms of receiving visitors. If they leave their counties open, I can tell you we are going to see a very serious viral infection rate in those counties. And some of them, as I've said before, are not remotely ready for COVID-19.
And also, Ben, I think when it comes to government communications on this, maybe it's time for them to restructure their communications and start using percentages. Like, for instance, if you test 1,000 people, maybe you end up getting 100% who are positive. If you test 10,000, you will get up maybe 1,000 who are positive. Now, when the minister or the CS doesn't break this thing into percentages, at some stage it may send unnecessary alarm and fears in society. Because, you know, the headline will scream, and 1,000 found to be positive. I think they need to restructure the messaging and go to percentages so that the average Kenyan has got a very clear understanding of the infection trajectory.
All right, let's leave it there. Time for another quick commercial break. When we come back, we shall be expecting to hear from you. You can call in studio with your views, comments, and questions about our debates today. The reflections from Sabasaba. We've talked about the current, the looming financial crisis at the counties following the failure by the Senate to agree on a formula for sharing revenue among the 47 counties, and of course, the COVID-19 restrictions being eased by the president. Be sure to tell us what you think. Let me read a couple of tweets here, and Ayub Abdikadir says, electoral justice is a constant problem. The political class are the variables. In 2007, the ECK, Electoral Commission of Kenya, disowned its own management of the election. In 2013, the Supreme Court of Kenya settled the election, and in 2017, the Supreme Court fingered IEBC for illegalities and irregularities. John Wango says, if BBI was people-driven, why should it wait for Raila to jet back home? It belongs to the elite to achieve a certain agenda. In fact, even the elites themselves do not seem to agree. Keep texting us and tweeting us at Ben_Kitili at KTN News K. The hashtag is Inside Politics. Don't go too far.